All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Okay, so we're right at 4:30, so I think we can get started. Just fixing a couple things on my screen. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll start off with the workshop. All righty. And throughout the workshop today, if anybody can't hear me, you can come off mute if you need or put something in the chat. But thank you everyone for joining today's session. This is the session on co-creating health material, an inclusive approach to testing communication materials with limited health literacy users or consumers. So before we get started, I want to do some brief introductions. So I'll go first. Hello, everyone. My name is Brittany Linton, and I'm a senior user experience researcher at Communicate Health. And I do have a background in health communication, journalism, education, and fashion retail. And I know those are a lot of different industries, but they all encompass aspects of human-centered design, which is an approach I use every day in my work. So whether that's doing focus groups or usability testing or in-depth interviews, it's all to better understand our audience and design health information that's easy to use and understand. And with that, I'll pass it over to Corinne to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Happy Halloween. Thanks for being with us. I'm sure if you are on the East Coast, it's getting close to that witching hour. I know I have kids going out this evening, so we'll try and be right on time today, but we're really looking forward to having this discussion with you all. As Brittany said, my name is Corinne. I am a subject matter expert in communication and behavioral science. I've worked with Communicate Health for the last 6.5 years, and I've spent the better part of 15 or 16 years in the health communication consulting space, particularly on the research side. So I'm very thankful and appreciative to be here today with Brittany, who's going to mostly run the show. I'll just be here to help her out and chime in from time to time with some of our discussion. So I'll turn it back to you, Brittany. Thanks.
Thanks, Corinne. All right, so before we get into everything that we're going to do in the workshop today, just want to take a quick moment to tell you all a little bit about what we do at Communicate Health and about our organization. So we are a mission-based health communication and research company, and we serve a range of clients, that being federal, state, local government clients, as well as for-profit companies and nonprofit organizations. And our mission is really to improve the lives of individuals by designing health information, products, and digital tools that are easy to understand, access, and use. And we approach this mission by having a real strong focus on plain language accessibility and usability. And you might hear those terms come up later in our workshop, but we'll move on for now. All right. So as Corinne mentioned, it is Halloween. So want to do a quick icebreaker to both get folks in the spirit of Halloween and also help focus our conversation today. So you all can go ahead and use the chat and just start off by sharing your favorite candy over chat. Okay, we have Snickers, Twix. All right, we got some chocolate fans. More chocolate fans. Okay, Milky Way, Butterfinger. Gummy bears. I'm with you on gummy bears, Cheryl. And I will share mine as well. I am a Sour Patch person. Okay, gummy bears. That's 2 for gummy bears. All right, licorice. Okay. All right. Thank you all for sharing that. Too many to choose from. Yes, for sure, Danielle. I hear you there. Well, hopefully we can all get our favorite candy later on today. So now the second thing I would like you all to you put in the chat is share one word that describes effective health communication. Okay, accessible, clear. See another clear, understood, relevant, simple, simplicity. Okay. Yeah, so I'm seeing a lot of similar things around having clarity, making things understandable, relatable, making sure it's simple. All right. Well, thank you all for sharing empathy. Very good point, Julia. All right. Well, thank you all for sharing those. So for today, what you're all going to learn today is you'll learn about challenges that people who have limited health literacy skills experience in communication research. You'll also learn about health literacy principles that can be applied to testing. And then lastly, you'll learn about the co-creation method for testing materials with limited health literacy users. And towards the end, you'll have an opportunity to actually practice this co-creation method a little later on. And as you all are using the Zoom chat already, feel free, if you have any questions that come up along the way, just pop those over in Zoom and we'll do our best to address those as we go along. All right. So designing for health literacy, let's start off with that. So why health literacy matters. So basically in an equitable society, everyone needs to be able to use products and services. And for health communication products, access and inclusion are public health issues that have some severe consequences. So when designing for health literacy, it's really important to consider equity and inclusion, both when creating and also when testing health communication materials. And we all know that health literacy is how well people can find, understand, and use health information. And for folks with limited health literacy skills or limited literacy skills, it can easily affect how a person is able to read and process information. But it's really important to remember that anyone can have limited health literacy skills. So at Communicate Health, we often talk about this, and we say that health literacy is a state, it's not a trait. So even folks who have high health literacy or high literacy skills can have low health literacy skills in some situations. So thinking about if someone is stressed, or maybe if they're anxious or sick, even if they have those higher literacy skills, it can affect how they are interpreting health information in those situations. So we're going to talk now a little bit more about what we know about people who have limited literacy skills. All right. So for reading and cognitive processing, so reading can be a lot of work for folks because it both involves decoding and understanding text. And people with limited literacy skills have more problems with short-term memory or working memory than people with higher literacy skills. So if a material or a web page maybe has a large amount of content, they may not be able to remember it all. Furthermore, what they do remember might not be the most important thing that stood out to them. And people with limited literacy skills generally read more slowly. They might reread certain words, and they might also skip over content. And they may also get distracted by extra words or elements. So thinking if you're looking at a material or a website, folks might get distracted by links or icons that are on the page. So it's super important to keep some of these challenges in mind, both when you're creating and when you're testing health communication material with this audience. And you'll hear me say both creating and testing throughout this workshop, because those things really go hand in hand, and you'll start to see how some of those things we know when we're creating health communication material also apply to testing. All right, and so I want to share a quick example So I'm going to read this slide here. So excessively loquacious documents will create an overabundance of neural activity in the cerebrum or temporal lobes, resulting in numerous inefficiency, diversions in attention, and a higher likelihood for misinterpretation. In turn, this results in substantially more resource usage on the part of the communicator. So you may have noticed what I did there with this example. And as you can see in this slide, there is a ton of language and not all of it is in plain language. So if you read it, you're likely to find yourself maybe moving a little bit slowly, like even for me reading it, I had to kind of read it slowly and pay very close attention. You may even find yourself pausing to pronounce certain words or try to figure out some of the jargon. So in general, plain language isn't about dumbing down content. It's more about using the right language to help readers move more easily through information and be able to process it and actually retain it. Oh, and I'm just checking on the chat. Oh, wow. Yes, I can imagine that that would make my brain tired as well. All right, so what I'd like you all to do now is thinking about some of those challenges that we just shared for people who have limited literacy skills. I'd like you all to use the chat, or if you feel comfortable, you can come off of mute and share verbally. But I'm curious, what, if any, strategies have you used to ensure materials or communications are supporting those with limited literacy? Okay, chunking information. Keeping sentences short, cognitive interviewing, active voice, breaking things down. Okay, using supportive images, simple words, readability tests, white space, reduce the amount of jargon. Okay. White space images, run them by patients, include the target audience. All right. So some of these you all already mentioned, but I'm going to share just a couple so we can all align. So these are some health literacy best practices that are good to keep in mind when creating health communication material. So I know a lot of you mentioned things around having simple words or eliminating the jargon. So it's super important to choose those simple words. So thinking about words people are likely to be familiar with, or maybe they're likely to hear in everyday conversation, or words that they're just likely to use themselves. So especially if you're wondering how to know which terms to use for your audience, testing that content with them is super important to get that direct feedback. And that's what we'll get into a little bit later. And I know folks started to talk about those things in chat around talking to that target audience. Another thing to keep in mind is putting the most important information first. So as I mentioned earlier, people with limited literacy skills often struggle with working memory. So when you present new information first, the reader has to hold that information in their head until they get to the context, which tells them how to interpret the information. And then this then decreases their capacity for reading. And similar to that, it's good to put the most important information first, but also making sure you're including that need to know information to help users with limited literacy skills process that information. So anything that isn't really necessary to have in a document or on a website, you can eliminate it. And then I know folks also brought up some things around chunking the text or breaking things down. And that is definitely a health literacy best practice. So long blocks of text are often hard for readers to get through. This is especially true for folks who have limited literacy skills. That's why one reason it's important to break up that text. It helps to divide it into, clear and informative headers so people can easily scan documents or scan web pages. We'll also want to use images that can help people learn. So I think someone else mentioned that in the chat as well. And it's super important to have those realistic images that can actually support your text. And that can help users with limited literacy skills find and understand, communicate, and use health information. But when it comes to imagery, it's also important to be careful on the imagery that you're picking. So imagery can have a lot of meaning, so you want to make sure that you're choosing images that convey the intended meaning. So you don't want to make sure that you're not reinforcing stereotypes. And then lastly, providing clear and actionable steps for a specific health behavior and making sure those steps are relatable to your audience and they're accessible for your audience. And there are plenty of other best practices that we could include, but we're going to focus on these ones. And we'll talk a little bit later about how it's important to think about these for creating health communication material, but also how you test your material is just as important, especially with this audience. All right. So next, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the health literacy best practices that we went through and how those can be applied to material testing and how you can use a co-creation approach to more effectively gather insights from your audience. So I have another question for the group. So before we start talking about material testing, I'd like to hear from you all. So using the chat, or again, if you want to share verbally, you can. I'm curious, when you're testing materials with limited literacy consumers, what kinds of things do you look for when you're testing with this audience? Okay, second opinions, if they resonate with the images, understanding. Furrowed brows, yes. Getting those gestures to figure out how folks are reacting to material. Clean, simple, easy, breezy material, okay. The length of time it takes them to process, if folks are struggling with certain information. Again, the amount of time it takes to process. Yeah, and I see what makes them want to take action, okay. The questions they ask. Yeah, I see, Caroline, you mentioned partner through whole development, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that co-creation approach in a moment. So curious to hear your thoughts later on, questions that are raised. All right. Well, thank you all for sharing those. As I mentioned, keep all of these points in mind. When we get to our activity later, we're going to be revisiting some of them. So keep in mind some of those questions you might be asking folks in a testing session, or things you might be looking for. All right, so in general, when conducting material testing, we're often exploring different questions to better understand how our audience is understanding the material and their impressions of it. So some of the questions we may ask are the materials clear and easy to understand? Are the materials culturally and personally relevant? Are the materials visually appealing? And are the materials actionable? There are some other ones that we may explore, like credibility and things like that, but these are some of the main ones.
Brittany, I wanted to chime in real quick with, I think it was great to see sort of how everyone's observations or the things that they share that they're looking for when they're doing testing came up. Because there's a lot of overlap with the questions that we ask ourselves as researchers, right? These are typically the kind of the variables, if you will, that we're looking for. We're trying to understand whether or not our materials have been designed effectively. Are they clear and easy to understand, right? But in doing that, we have to look for certain cues among our participants. And sometimes those will be things like the furrowed brow or the rereading of sections, or not being able to sort of accurately interpret what a main message is from a material. And one of the things that I wanted to just touch on a little bit more here are the question that we ask around materials and their visual appeal. I think that's something that, at least in the health literacy space, that we're learning a lot more about, and we're really exploring and thinking about not just does the visual elements like the design or the photos or any kind of imagery that are being used, not only does it sort of garner attention, but also thinking about from a reader's perspective, anyone who might be who might have limited literacy skills. We know that motivation also plays a big role in readability and understanding. When someone perceives that a material looks difficult, they are going to be less likely to want to read that, to sort of persevere through trying to understand it. But when a material is appealing visually and seems easy to read, they're going to be more likely to engage with it. So I think it's important to consider both from a the visual appeal, both from a garner attention perspective, but also from a health literacy perspective.
Thanks for sharing that, Corinne. Great point. So it's a lot of it sometimes is reading between the lines, because as we know, sometimes folks can say, oh yeah, this was easy to understand, but we pick up on some other cues that make us think otherwise. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about some common practices in material testing that some of you may already be familiar with. But basically in the work that we do, we all follow a human-centered design, or HCD process, and we really strive to involve our audience at multiple stages or multiple steps along the way. However, as some of you may be able to speak to, that's not always feasible. So as public health communicators, sometimes we don't always have the time or the money to test materials at each stage. So we'll try to maybe squeeze one round of testing into a project, and maybe that's just testing the content, or maybe we're testing a fully designed material. So with that time and budget constraint, we might not be able to test materials at each stage. So, but testing a design material, we might start by giving participants time to review the material on their own. So that includes a fully designed material. They review the content, the images, the colors, all the design elements. And then after they review it, we might ask them their first impressions around their likes or their dislikes. And then we'll get into clarity, and we might ask them about certain words or phrases that are unclear or maybe are confusing, or what the main purpose of the material is. And then we'll get into the visual appeal and ask about the images that stood out or things that might have rubbed them in the wrong way. And then we'll talk a little bit more about relevance, asking, what part of the material that resonated with them the most. And then we'll get into actionability, which these are all things that you all mentioned over chat. What would someone do next? Or what, if any, questions do folks have after reading something? Now, one of the biggest limitations of testing in this way, or testing an almost finished material, is that we're asking participants to explain what they like or dislike about the material, but they can't always tell us that why. So that gets back to reading between the lines, and it can be a little bit tricky when showing an almost finished material. So for an example, they might not be able to explain the fact that there's a combination of a specific image or specific language that is used that is making things unrelatable to them, because there's a lot of things that are going on in the material at once. So testing this fully designed material can feel overwhelming for participants. And then for the researcher, it actually might be a little bit more difficult for them to then draw some level of nuance that's needed to really maximize the effectiveness of the material and read between those lines, as we were talking about.
Brittany, I wanted to mention, Claudia brought up a good point in the chat around the fact that whenever possible, being able to use a variety of data sources is even more valuable to be able to assess our materials. Claudia was talking about sort of some of the limitations of eye tracking, for example, that we often aren't able, just by looking at people's gaze patterns and seeing where they're looking on a page or what they're seeing on a material, and how long they're lingering somewhere. Is it, for what reason, right? We don't know the why behind that. And so she was describing how some of her neuromarketing measures and her research practices are incorporating things like facial analysis to kind of bring in that piece around people's sentiment that may be tied to some of those other measures. And Claudia, feel free to chime in if there's anything I missed.
Okay, but keep going. You guys are doing great.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Claudia. I definitely hear you there. And whenever possible, it is always helpful to use different data sources to better understand what's actually going on with our health products. I do a lot of work with analytics too, and I don't know, from analytics, sometimes it's really tricky to understand the why behind things. So, but when you pair that with other forms of research, we can better tell that story. So great point. All right. So next, we're going to get into a couple of benefits on co-creation and how you can apply this type of approach to material testing. All righty. So for a co-creation approach to material testing, it involves isolating different aspects of the material. So isolating the content, the design, and other aspects, but building them with participants in real time during testing. So I know before we were talking about, because of time and budget, there are limitations of testing materials at all different stages. But with the co-creation approach, we're talking about testing different aspects separately, but all during one session. So with this approach, it gives participants a seat at the table. So when participants feel that they're a part of the creation process or the development process, they're a little bit more likely to feel like they have ownership over what is being designed. And they may better reflect, they may be able to tell you how they better resonate with the material, or how they identify with it, or how their group identifies with it. With this approach, you can also apply health literacy best practices. So one thing you can do is you can focus on the need to know information, and you can break up content into chunks. So while that is something we do when we're actually designing a health education or a health communication material, those best practices can be applied. So by separating out those different aspects of a material, that is a form of almost breaking up the content, or just focusing on the need to know information at different points of the process. And this co-creation approach also supports users who have limited literacy skills. So as we've been talking about before, folks with limited literacy skills often have problems with working memory, and too much content can be harder to remember. So if someone has to look at a fully designed material, they might not be remembering all the different aspects or things that stood out to them. So by isolating each aspect, you can keep a participant a bit more focused on one thing at a time, and you can get that feedback in the moment. So if you're focusing just on the content and they're not seeing all the other things, they're able to better understand what you're trying to ask them. And overall, this form method can help you gain more nuanced insights. So basically, by breaking apart each of our research questions and asking participants to respond to those directly, we're more likely to get what we want to know. So get really below the surface level and understand what we need to do to improve this material. So for an example, let's say we wanted to know whether our content is actionable or not. We'll ask them about the first step they will take after reading a material, so what they would do next. And if they answer, I don't know, then we likely need to change something in the content or design and really make action steps to make that more clear. And I'll pause there before we're gonna go into kind of a step-by-step process of what this co-creation method looks like using a case study, but I'll just pause to see if there's any questions, or Corinne, if you have anything else you'd like to add. All righty. Okay, so this case study that we're going to show it's called I Health, My Health. So this is testing that we did with the National Eye Institute's I Health, My Health campaign, which is focused on raising awareness for Black/African American people, specifically raising awareness about eye health. And this testing was done to inform the development of the I Health, My Health campaign. And basically, we conducted testing on materials to inform the design and messaging strategy for this campaign. And we did testing with the campaign's audience, which was Black/African Americans who vary in level of risk for developing an eye condition or disease. And basically, what we learned from this study helped inform updates to the design and messaging strategy to make it more useful and relevant for our audience. Now, I'll start off by sharing what we did in step one. So this was the content. So basically what we did is, and this was all in a single session, as I mentioned before, we had participants first review the written content only of the material. So no designs, no images. And at this stage, we really focused on assessing the clarity and understanding of the material. And we asked participants about the purpose or main message, who they thought the intended audience was, and if they resonated with any words or phrases. And you'll notice throughout each step, we did continue to test relevance, because we really wanted to see if folks were resonating with specific aspects of the material, whether there's certain words or phrases that they resonated with. And there were also some eye healthy tips that we wanted to see if they were actionable for our audience. So I'll show what this looked like. So this was a fact sheet. It's called Healthy Eyes, Healthy You. And this is what it looked like in the content stage. And you'll see that it's just bare bones written content. There's no design. There is some level of organization with the heading structure, and that's, of course, for readability purposes. So in our next stage, we went to the design and layout. So at this stage, well, we took the content and we added in the look and feel, and we actually showed participants 2 look and feel options without any images. So in this stage, we gathered their feedback on the visual appeal of design elements. So like what they liked or disliked about the colors, or maybe the shapes that were used in each look and feel option. And again, which aspects they resonated with the most. And I'll show you all what it looked like here. So these are the 2 look and feel options. So we showed both of these side by side. And as I mentioned, you can see the images are not in here. And there were 2 pages of the document, but just for space, I'm just showing the first page of each one. So after we did the design and layout stage, then we moved on to images. So in this stage, we had participants just take one look and feel option. And we had that when we showed them a series of images. And basically participants picked the images they preferred for each section of the material. And then we dragged the preferred images into the empty spaces. So at this point, we were gathering feedback on the images participants found personally relevant, anything that caught their attention, or things that rubbed them in the wrong way. And I'll show you all what it looked like here. So what we did is we had the material on one side, and then we had a list of images on the other side. And we asked participants to actually pick the images that they would put in each section. So we would ask them, what image would you put for the header? What image would you put for Get Active? Choose iHealthy Foods. So that way they're pulling in the image that they resonate with or prefer the best for each section. And what we did, I'll mention during the session, is we also alternated between the 2 look and feel options just to make sure we were getting comprehensive feedback. And then in our last step, oh, and great question, Andrea, about the question is, what was the testing done in person? Do you think you could use e-advisors for feedback in stages? So the testing was actually done online. So and we're actually going to be using the tool that we used in our workshop later on, but it's called Miro. It's a virtual whiteboard similar to like FigJam. Google has virtual whiteboards, but essentially we set up each of these stages in the virtual whiteboard. So it allowed us to easily go from each stage. So we didn't have to stop sharing one screen and reshare and move to different windows. Everything was consolidated in one space. All right, so for the fully designed material, at this stage, this was the last stage, and where folks are looking now at both look and feel options with the preferred images that they chose from step 3. And also what we did in this stage is we revealed the main message and the intended audience. So typically we don't always tell participants what the material is actually intended for, like reveal the secret essentially. But we decided to reveal this after they had went through all those stages. And why we did this was to further test if the material was personally and culturally relevant. We were looking to see if anything had changed from when they saw the material, just the content only, to now that seeing it fully designed. And so we asked participants questions like, if you saw this material, would you think it was for you? And I'll show you everyone what this looked like in this stage. So as you can see, all the images are in the empty spaces. So what we actually did in the session, this is one part where we did stop screen sharing. So after folks had picked their preferred images, we stopped screen sharing. We pulled in their preferred images for both look and feel options so that they could see them side by side. And then we asked them which material they resonated with the most. So now that they're looking at the different designs with the images that they like, which one do they want to go with? And that was super helpful in understanding what truly made something relevant for them. And it helped piece apart our initial question around personal and cultural relevance. Alrighty, so I'm gonna pause here. In a moment, we're gonna go ahead and do our activity as a group. And we'll get to practice doing this co-creation approach. But before we move on, I do want to just pause to see if there's any questions. So the software we used was Miro, and I'm actually going to be showing that software in a moment. Oh, so it's a virtual whiteboard, and I will say there are other platforms to use. There's also Mural, which is very similar as well.
Brittany, one point I wanted to bring up, since we might not get to our follow-up questions at the end, which is when this was probably going to be raised, is you know, we're obviously fortunate to, given that we're in a communication firm, we have graphic designers at our disposal, right? And so they were developing some of the look and feel and some of the branding ideas, and we were working within the context of an existing brand with NIH, right? So I always like to offer sort of, if you're doing this on a shoestring budget, right? Or if you are doing this in a within an organization or in support of a community group that doesn't have a lot of resources or doesn't have a full-time graphic designer, there's also some nice ways here that, especially with the design elements, that you can crowdsource. So, you know, perhaps you're asking, instead of showing a variety of mock-ups to your participants, you're asking them just to go on to Google Images and find you some examples of what kind of imagery might work for that fact sheet, or looking for some specific colors or designs of other materials that are out on the internet. You know, there's a lot that's out at our disposal. And that can be used to sort of crowdsource, and you following this same kind of method, but don't necessarily have to have all the stimuli pre-prepared and ready to go to share. So I just wanted to throw that out as another way of you know, kind of iterating on this idea, but maybe when you have less graphic design resources at your disposal.
Yeah, great point, Corinne. Thanks for sharing. And everyone can keep that in mind too when we move into this activity. Think about, you know, what you do in your role, or what if you did not have as much budget? What are some creative ideas you can do to still co-create with your audience? Alrighty, so I'm gonna move us along. So for our activity, and we'll do this through the end, because I know we have about 18 minutes. Yeah, 18 minutes left. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to take an existing health communication material. So in this scenario, I would like everyone to pretend or imagine that you're looking at an almost finished fact sheet. So the one we have up here is about HIV testing. This is actually a publicly available fact sheet that's on the CDC website. But for this scenario, let's pretend that it's almost finished. And we need to further develop it. So we're going to test it out, and we're going to take a co-creation approach. So as a group, we're going to walk through some of these prompts to figure out how we all would want to test this material and how we might test specific elements. And like Corinne said, thinking about any creative ways we can test certain elements, especially if you don't have a designer on your team or something like that. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to pull up the Miro board. And as a reminder, this is the same tool that we used for the actual testing. And just in case folks can't see on my screen, I'm also going to share the actual stimuli or material that we are testing for this scenario. So feel free to open that if you need, and I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Can you see that? Good. Okay. All right. So I'm going to pull these up side by side. And I'm going to give everyone just a few minutes to skim through this material. And And then we can talk a little bit about how we might approach a co-creation approach. So I'll give everyone a couple of minutes, and then we'll have some questions to discuss. Great question. I should have went over that before. So this material is specifically for HIV testing in schools. So this could be something that it's for schools, but specifically for adolescents, but it could be like a school administrator or someone like that. Yes, Andrea, school nurses, administrators, school boards. In terms of how it's distributed, I guess that could be a couple different ways. It could be maybe it's available online and folks access it that way, or maybe it's sent out to school over email. Yeah, I'll leave that up to you all though to think through. All right, I'll give another minute just to take some time to skim through that material, and it's okay if you don't read everything. Alrighty, so it's 5:18. All right. All right, so what I'm going to have folks do. Oh, did we have a question? Okay, so Janet, you're saying even if it is for educator, there's a lot of information gathered on different directions. Yeah, so that's actually a great point. So I would think about that's another layer of how you might test that. And would you maybe test certain content at one point, since there are a lot of different areas or different directions?
And that's often Brittany, I'll just throw out that often that's a question that we're asking in this first phase of, we're sitting down with our priority audience, having them review draft content. And in this case, we would sort of separate out the content from this fact sheet and have them read it. And we might ask them who they think this is for, right? Because they're going to draw some inferences on, the language or some of the statistics that are being used or the examples, the tone, word choice, things like that. And that sometimes helps us understand, have we struck the right tone? Are we using the right words? Do we have too many audiences for this fact sheet? Do we need to maybe create an administrator version and a teen version, or, a nurse's version, right? depending on how they react to the content and whether or not they resonate with it, we may have to step back and revisit that. So that was a great point.
Mhm. All right. So what we're going to do now is we have these discussion questions that I like you all to kind of think about at each stage. So the first one we'll focus on, and feel free if you'd like to jump ahead, you can. But I'm curious, how might you all organize this session if you were testing with users who have low health literacy skills? So thinking about how you might break up the different aspects of the material, similar to that step-by-step method we went before. So there is a lot going on in this material. So I'm curious, starting off with the content, how might folks break up the content in this material? What might you do in that step one? So thinking about, and I can write in as folks are writing things in the chat. So thinking about how you might set up that first step, and also what questions you might ask at this stage. Okay, discuss keywords and definitions. Oh, and I see we have a hand raised.
Yeah, hi. I thought I would just speak up if that's okay versus type in the chat. My thought was maybe separate out the data points versus the key concepts and try to go over the key concepts first and then kind of bring in discussion of the data after that.
Okay. Yeah, tell me a little bit more when you say separate the key concepts and the data points. What are you referring to?
Well, when I was reading through it, and if I were going to have someone with low literacy sort of review, I kind of sort of bounced around between what was written in text and the data points. So I would think it's better to sort of talk about the general concepts first and then maybe bring in the data points as supporting, maybe just so it's not as overwhelming, as discussing it conceptually.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
I think that's also a fantastic sort of rationale or support for why this method can be so valuable. I think pointing out here, there could be a lot of things going on. Maybe I'm jumping around because there's so many colors. Maybe I'm jumping around because there's these designed call out boxes. Maybe I'm jumping around because there's too much content, right? There's a lot of different elements that we're trying to figure out what is going wrong here. And normally we don't do it in reverse. We don't take the fully designed material and try to validate each piece one by one. But that's what we're sort of asking you all to do here, is to tell us how might you break this apart and test each of those kind of individual pieces. So I love that. Thanks for sharing.
Can I chime in too? So based on her point too, if you go back to the board, the weighting of the content isn't clear. Typically, whenever I'm designing something, I look at what's most important, you make that largest. And our eye flows from top to bottom, left to right. So we want to make sure that whatever we're putting in there, the most important points, we're leading them from the biggest, boldest at the top, and then what are they reading about? And then calling out those highlight points where they're larger. And there's so much weighting here that seems similar, especially with the magenta coloring, that your eye does really hop around a lot. And instead of it giving you that, it's just by the data points, like you look here, you say 25, 20, 85, 44, 5, 7, but you're not getting that snippet of information with that data point. You're just getting the number. And so I think for people, the way we digest data is when we see something more like next to the student with the orange jacket where it says 16 million high school students every day, like that's what we take away, are those little snippets that go together that are weighted the same. So I think that could be something that I would suggest to improve on this.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Sorry, I don't see the name, but appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, and I'm actually curious with that. So thinking about, that best practice of putting the need to know information, or that people are going to kind of, their eye is going to go to the information that's standing out the most. Imagine that this material only had the content here. What, if anything, would you do? Like, how might you test that? Let's say if you did want to understand which content folks find most important, how would you approach that?
Is that directed towards me? Because I have an
You
answer.
can answer. Go
So,
ahead.
people, when they read things, look at the first and the last paragraph. So you're looking at the summary. And if you think about, even when as professionals, we read about, different published journals, we're looking for the summary first, and we go back and try to find the details of what we want to learn more about. So it's helping people see a summary first of what they're learning. And then if they want to dig into the details, you give them that information later where they can kind of index it in their head. So you highlight, maybe in a little larger font, the summary of what they're learning, and then you bring into it details, maybe using some bullet points to make things a little easier to look at and list versus tons of copy. That would be my suggestion if you were going to remove all the graphics.
Okay.
Brittany, chiming in with a couple of notes from the chat, I think folks were thinking about in terms of, sort of getting feedback and testing this content. We had a comment about percentages and needing to look at and get participants to potentially react to their interpretation or their understanding, the meaning making that they have from looking at those stats. And we also, there was some discussion a little bit earlier on around perceived audience, and whether or not maybe some of this information is being confused because they're trying to include too much for different audiences in one fact sheet.
Yeah, great points. And it makes me think about, if you were to piece apart this material, thinking about those percentages or other content you want to test, maybe even pulling it out those pieces and saying, all right, I'm going to take this chunk of text and ask folks what they think the main purpose of this text, this small group of text, and that could be that first paragraph up top, and ask them what the main purpose is and who they think the intended audience is. And that might help you then understand, all right, wait a minute, folks are thinking this piece of information is for this audience, and then this piece of information is for another audience. And you could do that in the actual testing session. Okay. And then I know we have a couple more minutes, so we could talk a little bit about, let me see. Yeah, I'm curious. We started to touch on this a little bit with the challenges, but I'm curious, what if testing this material in a step-by-step process where you're maybe testing the content or doing some type of co-creation approach, I'm curious, what potential challenges do you think may arise as you're testing this material? So not so much thinking about the material itself, but how it's being tested. What potential challenges might occur with this audience? Okay, color blindness, great point. Feeling overwhelmed. Yeah. Content feels really high for someone with low literacy. Yeah, and I want to touch on your point, Cheryl, around feeling overwhelmed. Because this is actually something I've been thinking a lot about too, is the purpose of separating out the different pieces of a material is to help folks feel a little less overwhelmed and to test the pieces specifically. But with this method, you also are creating more stages. So I'm curious, how might we, help participants feel less overwhelmed in that type of process? So if we have a co-creation approach and we're bringing them to the seat of the table, but it may feel a little bit more overwhelming, how might we minimize that? And anyone can answer. Stoplight. You might have to tell me a little bit more about that one.
It's just a technique where people sort of use red, yellow, and green when they're looking at. It's easier to use when they're actually seeing it in front of them than seeing it on a board like this, which may be something that would be helpful as well for those of us who are not digital natives. Having documents right in front of us makes it easier for us to evaluate them and look at them. But the red, yellow, and green basically says, I understand. Green would be, I understand this. There's no problem here, but red is, this is hard for me to understand. And yellow is, this is okay, but could be better.
Gotcha. Yeah,
I
thank you.
think Andrea's point about giving people categories or buckets to put things into, we often do that in rating exercises or, even like with collaging, one way to sort of reduce the cognitive load here would be, let me give you 10 pictures to look at and you're picking the ones you like the most, rather than saying, go to Google Images and find me stuff, right? That might be a way of just sort of reducing the burden a little bit, but still giving them that agency to pick what speaks to them.
Yeah, great points. And I know we're, oh, I saw someone come off mute. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to add, someone put in the chat, giving the resource ahead of time so people have a chance to look at what's there. I agree with that. Or also just sort of pulling back a little bit and just sort of having a conversation with the people, because I feel like some of the topics that are in here, there's just a lot. So maybe just pulling back and just asking what they know about some of these things to start, and then going from there and like slowly bringing in the individual pieces of this resource to review it and say, like, does this help you understand more? Like, is this confusing? And then sort of build it out from there.
Great points. Yeah, thank you for sharing, and thank you, Cheryl, for putting that in the chat. So it definitely sounds like there's a little upfront work we could probably do to help ease participants into the session. Alrighty, so I don't want to take up any more time, but just want to thank everyone so much for participating in this workshop and helping us kind of think a little bit more through this co-creation approach. And I know we didn't get to some of our other questions, but I would love folks to continue to think about co-creation in your work, especially in the testing setting. You know, we did talk about material testing today, but how can you apply co-creation to message testing, to usability testing, or any other communication practices that you do? So with that, we'll wrap up, and I hope everyone has a great Halloween and you can all go enjoy your favorite candies that you shared earlier.
Thanks everyone for your participation and joining us. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks.
Thanks all.